Hey, it's Soyeon. As usual on Sundays, I talk about 5 top news of the week in East Asia. The first news of the week is about South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol's trip to Central Asia. Central Asia is a sub-region of the Asian continent, stretching from the Caspian Sea in the west to western China and Mongolia in the east, and from Russia in the north to Afghanistan and Iran in the south. It comprises 5 former Soviet republics: Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan. From June 10th to 15th, South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol made a week-long trip to 3 of the 5 Central Asian countries, namely Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, and Uzbekistan. Accompanied by First Lady Kim Gun-hee and over 60 Korean companies, Yoon aims to create new business opportunities for Korean companies in the fields of energy, critical minerals, and infrastructure. According to Kim Tae-hyo, first Deputy Director of the Presidential National Security Office, South Korea wants to integrate its innovation prowess with Central Asia's economic development potential based on strong trust and solidarity. On Monday, June 10th, Yoon arrived in Ashgabat, Turkmenistan for the first leg of his trip. Yoon and his counterpart President Berdimuhamedow signed 8 cooperation documents including a trade and investment promotion framework and cooperation agreements on gas fields and chemical facilities. They also discussed future collaboration in the fields of shipbuilding, public health, and climate change. The following day, Yoon traveled to Kazakhstan. He met President Tokayev on Wednesday. The leaders signed 35 memoranda of understanding, including one notable on strengthening cooperation in the supply chain of essential minerals. Kazakhstan has a lot of chromium needed to harden steel for heavy industries, and uranium used to power nuclear reactors and produce materials for medical, industrial, and defense purposes. This agreement will enable South Korea and Kazakhstan to work together on the entire production cycle from exploration of essential minerals to their final use. In addition, they agreed to cooperate in the fields of energy, technology, environment, and agriculture. On Thursday, June 13th, President Yoon arrived in Tashkent, Uzbekistan for the final leg of his trip. On Friday, June 14th, Yoon and President Mirziyoyev agreed to strengthen their special strategic partnership and institutionalize cooperation. Notably, they made a deal to export South Korea's domestically developed high-speed train KTX. It marks Korea's first deal to export their homegrown bullet train. To sum up, Yoon's trip this week was a good opportunity for South Korea to strengthen cooperation in supply chains with resource-rich Central Asia. Yoon launched his administration's regional strategy for Central Asia under the name K-Silk Road Initiative. Korea views Central Asian nations as strategic partners with significant potential for South Korean businesses connecting Europe and Asia, and providing important resources like oil, gas, and key minerals. In recent years, South Korea suffers shortages in raw materials. This is due to the decision of China to restrict export. Therefore, Central Asia represents a good alternative source. Last week, South Korea also welcomed the Korea-Africa Summit in Seoul, highlighting the country's efforts to diversify potential sources of raw materials. In both Africa and Central Asia, Korea's raw materials diplomacy relies on leveraging its technical expertise and offering official development assistance to countries who can export valuable resources. Finally, President Yoon plans to organize Korea-Central Asia Summit next year. The second news of the week takes place in Russia. This is about the BRICS Foreign Ministers meeting. BRICS is an intergovernmental organization created in 2019 by 4 countries: Brazil, Russia, India, and China. South Africa joined a year later in 2010. Today, the bloc has expanded with the entry of Iran, Egypt, Ethiopia, and the United Arab Emirates on January 1, 2024. Originally identified to highlight investment opportunities, the group has evolved into a cohesive geopolitical bloc, whose governments have been meeting annually at official summits and coordinating multilateral policies since 2009. Bilateral relations between the BRICS are primarily based on non-interference, equality, and mutual benefit. At the BRICS Foreign Ministers meeting on June 10th to 11th, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi stressed the importance of expanding the bloc into a new multilateral cooperation mechanism focused on emerging markets in developing countries. In his address, Wang Yi highlighted the contrast between the inclusive and cooperative vision of the BRICS and smaller, more exclusive circles such as the G7. He He criticized the major powers for reviving Cold War mentalities and forming geopolitical small circles that undermine the authority of multilateral mechanisms such as the UN. He called for support for equitable global governance and a multilateral world order, that is, a world without US supremacy over other nations. In this context, he emphasized the role of the BRICS in promoting solidarity between emerging markets and developing nations, pointing out that the BRICS objective was not limited to economic cooperation, but also included political and cultural exchanges. During his meeting with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, Wang Yi reaffirmed China's commitment to supporting Russia's chairmanship of the BRICS and stressed the importance of Sino-Russian relations. Wang Yi also reiterated China's support for Palestine's accession to the United Nations and the resumption of peace talks in the Middle East. The leaders of the G7 countries met in Italy on Friday, June 14th. The G7 is an economic discussion and partnership group that brings together 7 of the 10 countries with the world's largest GDP: Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, the United Kingdom, and the United States. Each year, the G7 summit brings together the leaders of these countries, as well as the President of the European Commission and the President of the European Council. This week, G7 leaders issued a warning against China's trade practices. They also toughened their stance on Beijing's support for Russia and called on China to stop transferring dual-use materials, including weapon components and equipment, which are inputs for Russia's defense sector. On Thursday, US President Joe Biden declared that China is not supplying weapons, but the ability to produce those weapons and the technology available to do so it's actually helping Russia. The third news of the week is an opinion poll relations between Japan and South Korea. The Japanese newspaper Yomiuri Shimbun and the South Korean newspaper Hanguk-Ilbo conducted a survey to determine what the Japanese people think about their country's relationship with South Korea and what South Koreans think about their country's relationship with Japan. 1,045 people were interviewed in Japan and 1,000 in South Korea. The telephone survey was conducted beyond May 24th and 26th among voters aged 18 and over. The survey revealed that 50% of Japanese respondents believe that Japan has good relations with South Korea. This is the highest level since 2011 when the figure reached 53%. In South Korea, 42% of respondents said they have good relations with Japan, down from 43% last year. In Japan, 48% feel close to South Korea, while in South Korea, 33% consider being close to Japan, the highest level since 2013. As for future relations, 57% of Japanese and 49% of South Koreans are in favor of maintaining a friendship despite historical disagreement, while 41% of Japanese and 50% of South Koreans believe this would be difficult. When it comes to security cooperation with the USA, 86% of Japanese and 79% of South Koreans approved. When asked about the importance of the USA versus China, 73% of Japanese and 68% of South Koreans chose the USA, while 19% of Japanese and 28% of South Koreans chose China. Finally, when asked about the falling birth rate, a serious issue for both countries, only 18% of Japanese and 21% of South Koreans said they approved of the measures taken by their government. The fourth news of the week took place in Europe but concerns China. The European Commission announced its plan to impose tariffs on Chinese electric vehicle imports. The European Commission is one of the European Union's main institutions responsible for proposing and implementing community policies, such as imposing common external tariff on all goods entering the Union. On Wednesday, June 12th, the European Commission announced its intention to impose tariff of up to 38% on imports of Chinese electric vehicles from July onwards, in order to protect the European Union's car manufacturers. To better understand the context and the position of both sides, we need to take a closer look at how Chinese and European industries operate. For decades, the People's Republic of China has been providing state funding to domestic companies to help them achieve the long-term economic goals set by the government. Current priorities include developing battery electric vehicles, which is a sector expanding rapidly as nations move towards carbon neutrality. Meanwhile, the European Union has historically enjoyed a strong position in the car industry, with member states such as Belgium, Spain, France, Italy, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Poland ranking among the world's top 20 exporters. In Germany, the sector is considered a key industry, a major employer, and a driver of innovation and growth. As part of its Green Deal, the EU is legally bound to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by at least 55% by the end of the decade. Transport, a major polluting sector, has a role to play. After tough negotiations, member states and the European Parliament agreed to ban sales of combustion engine vehicles from 2035, making electric vehicles the new norm. Last year, over 1.5 million battery electric vehicles were sold in the EU, a 37% increase from 2022. This represents a market share of 14.6%, surpassing that of diesel with 13.6%. Meanwhile, China's economy has slowed, prompting companies to turn to exports to offset weak domestic demand. Electric cars from brands such as BYD, Geely, and SIC sold easily as they were sought after by environmentally conscious drivers. Above all, these cars were cheaper than those produced by European brands. The EU's tariff of up to 10% on foreign-made cars were also much lower than those imposed in the USA and India. This led to a drastic increase in imports of Chinese-made cars. The market share of Chinese brands in the EU battery electric vehicles market rose from 0.4% in 2019 to 7.9% in 2023, and could have exceeded 20% by 2027 if the trend had continued without the EU intervention. A few months ago, the European Commission launched an anti-subsidy probe into Chinese electric vehicles to determine whether Chinese green technology producers are dumping state-subsidized products on EU markets, giving Chinese car makers an unfair advantage. On average, the EU estimates that Chinese battery electric vehicles are 20% cheaper than their European counterparts. Commission officials have spent the last few months collecting data on the Chinese market and gathering feedback from industry players. Out of 21 Chinese groups exporting EVs to Europe, they reduced the sample size to 3: BYD, Geely, and SAIC. The executive determined that Beijing uses a wide range of subsidy measures such as grant, chip loans, and VAT reductions to boost its car industry and produce battery electric vehicles at artificially low prices. According to a senior official at the Commission, the probe revealed that the whole supply chain is subsidized. This means the Chinese government provides subsidies to all operators, from the refining of lithium used in batteries to the production and transport of battery electric vehicles to EU markets. The European Commission claims that global demand cannot keep pace with the increasing volumes of battery electric vehicles manufactured in China. This risks depriving European companies of the investment they need to remain competitive in the race to zero emissions. The Commission had planned to announce a decision shortly after the European elections on June 9th. On Wednesday, the percentage tariff that the EU will apply to electric vehicle imports from China were announced. The duties applied to most Chinese electric vehicle exports to Europe correspond to a weighted average of 21% calculated on the basis of subsidies recorded in the registers of the three companies surveyed. BYD and Geely will pay lower rates because they agreed to cooperate. BYD will face rates of 17.4% and Geely 20%. SAIC, on the other hand, did not comply and now faces the highest import duties at 38.1%, making its vehicles almost 50% more expensive. The new tariff, provisional until finalized on November 2nd, could be applied for at least 5 years. The Chinese Foreign Ministry described the probe as unjustifiable and protectionist, warning it could ultimately harm Europe's interests. The European Commission's announcement could trigger a trade war. China has already tried to derail the probe with threats of retaliatory tariff on European products in recent months. In January, it launched an anti-dumping proceeding on EU cognac shipment, seen as revenge on France, which was, along with Spain, one of the most vocal supporters of the EU stance. France shipped $1.8 billion worth of cognac to China last year, according to customs records. Last month, Chinese state media threatened tariff on European pork, cars, aviation, and dairy products. Now the Chinese government has warned it will not stand by following the introduction of the taxes and will take action to firmly safeguard its legitimate rights and interests. In a statement published on its official website, Chinese Ministry of Commerce spokesman He Yadong said the tariff lacked a factual and legal basis and constituted a militarization of economic and trade issues. Asked about possible emergency plans, a Commission spokesman refused to speculate and said the Commission's actions were solely aimed at restoring a level playing field and ensuring fair competition, in line with World Trade Organization rules. In early November, the Commission will present the proposal for permanent measures, which will be put to a vote by the member states. On the one hand, France and Italy supported the project. France called on Europe to strengthen its strategic autonomy. Italy wants to adopt an American-style assertive industrial policy. On the other hand, traditional defenders of the free market, such as Sweden and Ireland, expressed doubts about the additional duties. Hungary was firmly opposed. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz and his cabinet had publicly expressed skepticism, claiming that additional duties could harm the national economy. Canceling tariff will require a qualified majority. 15 member states representing at least 65% of the European Union population would have to vote against the proposal. The Commission could also close the case and remove the tariff, but only if the subsidies in question, which China has denied using, are withdrawn. The last news of the week is about the opening of diplomatic relations between South Korea and Cuba. On Wednesday, June 12th, Vice Foreign Minister Chung Byung-won and Carlos Pereira, Cuba's Director General for Bilateral Affairs, met in Seoul to discuss bilateral ties and the opening of diplomatic missions. These were the first talks between South Korea and Cuba since the establishment of diplomatic relations on February 14, 2024. This week, the two sides agreed that the establishment of diplomatic ties was an important step and pledged to strengthen their cooperation. Since April 28th, they have been planning to rapidly establish diplomatic missions in each other's countries to strengthen relations. Korea wants to establish a temporary office in Havana in the first half of this year, with officials visiting the Cuban capital this week to speed up the opening of an embassy. Mr. Pereira also highlighted Cuban efforts to open their embassy in Korea as soon as possible. He indicated that the Cuban embassy in Seoul could open as early as next month and confirmed efforts to speed up the process. Historically, Cuba established a socialist system after the 1959 Cuban Revolution, led by Fidel Castro, and announced privileged relations with North Korea, which also followed the socialist and anti-American stance. By doing so, Cuba severed ties with South Korea. During the Cold War, Cuba was hostile to South Korea and underlined its friendship with North Korea by boycotting the 1988 Summer Olympics in Seoul. Cuba turned to pragmatic diplomacy to overcome economic difficulties caused by the end of the Cold War in 1989 and the tightening of US sanctions, but it was reluctant to establish diplomatic relations with South Korea due to its ties with North Korea. Before the establishment of diplomatic relations between South Korea and Cuba, the South Korean embassy in Mexico acted as a consular agent for Cuba, and the Cuban embassy in Japan acted as a consular agent for South Korea. The announcement of the establishment of diplomatic relations between Cuba and South Korea on February 14, 2024, came as a blow to North Korea, which had been highlighting its fraternal ties with Havana. Let's finish this news review by taking a closer look at Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol's political strategy. If you have been following the news of the past week, you will have noticed that Yoon is multiplying his diplomatic gestures. Last week, he organized in Seoul the first summit between Korea and 48 African countries. This week, Yoon traveled to Central Asia and the Cuban delegation visited South Korea after establishment of bilateral relations for the first time. President Yoon's recent emphasis on foreign policy may be related to the midterm parliamentary elections held in April this year. In the elections, the opposition party, the Democratic Party, won the majority of votes and now represent the majority in parliament. Knowing that it is now harder for Yoon to pass legislation in a parliament where his party is in the minority, distinguishing himself on the international stage guarantees his public exposure and success in an area that falls exclusively within the government's area of competence. This way, he avoids setbacks at the national level, where important bills may be rejected by the opposition Democratic Party. Stay updated on all these topics and more with our daily news roundup on Instagram. It is an easy and effective way to keep up with the news. Check all the links in the description. Creating video content takes a lot of time, so please support us by leaving as many likes as you can. It really helps us out. And if you haven't subscribed yet, be sure to do so. See you soon!